They said she never feared death. In fact, she invited it in. In the dim corridors of her manor, servants whispered of strange bottles, rows of glass sealed with black wax. Each one, they claimed, held the final breath of a dying man. Not his body, not his blood, just that fleeting gasp, stolen as life slipped away. Travelers told of her carriage arriving at battlefields too late for rescue, yet always in time for the dying. She would kneel beside soldiers, priests, even beggars, pressing her vessel to their lips as their chests rose for the last time. Some swore she whispered to them in their final moments. Others said she only watched, cold and unblinking. The nobles of her age gathered jewels and titles, but she gathered something rarer, something no one else dared to touch. Why did she need them? What power did those bottled whispers grant her? And more unsettling still, what if some of them were opened? From the records of late medieval Europe, she is described only by fragments of names. In some accounts, she is Isolde of the North. In others, the Countess of G. Her true identity vanishes behind contradictions, yet the stories all point to one constant: a noblewoman whose obsession was not gold, not conquest, but the taking of the final exhale of mortal men. Her manor stood on the edge of war-torn lands, where armies clashed with brutal frequency. Chroniclers mention how she traveled with a small retinue, not soldiers, but servants who carried crates of delicate glass vessels. To the unknowing eye, it seemed like the luggage of an alchemist, but each flask was empty, waiting. When battle ended and the earth was soaked in blood, she did not send healers. She walked among the wounded herself. Imagine the scene. Soldiers crying for mothers who would never come, priests reciting hurried prayers, the silence between screams heavy with dread. And into this silence came the noblewoman, robes untouched by dirt, hands gloved in pale leather. She would kneel. She would press a bottle, its neck covered in cloth, against a dying man's lips. And then, just wait. The instant of death was her harvest. Witnesses claim that she carried a ledger, carefully marking each capture, not by name, but by manner of death: throat cut, arrow to lung, plague fever. Some say she believed different deaths produced different qualities in the breath. The violent exhale of a soldier brought her strength. The quiet sigh of a priest gave her foresight. And the rattle of a plague victim carried a curse strong enough to break enemies. She rarely spoke to her victims, but when she did, it was always the same words: "Exhale and you are mine." The phrase became legend among soldiers. To die in her presence was to leave behind not only your body, but your very essence, sealed and owned forever. Was this superstition? Perhaps, yet her growing influence in the courts was undeniable. Other nobles sought her favor, whispering that she carried something more potent than armies. She had the breaths of the dead, bottled, stacked, hidden in her chambers like a treasury of invisible currency. And this currency she did not spend carelessly. A servant once told, before vanishing mysteriously, that she would unseal a bottle during private rituals. Alone in candlelight, she would inhale the last breath of a chosen man. Her eyes rolled back, her body convulsed. When the ritual ended, she would speak truths no one else could know, predicting betrayals, revealing hidden crimes, naming the exact hour of an enemy's death. Those who scoffed at her practices often paid with their lives. One lord mocked her before the king, calling her the collector of air. That night, he was found in his chambers, suffocated without a mark on his body. Rumors spread that she had broken the wax seal of his own cousin's final breath and set it free in the darkness of his room. The more her power grew, the more men feared her. And yet, strangely, they still came to her. Knights offered themselves to her chambers, thinking their deaths might grant them immortality of a twisted kind. Scholars begged to see her collection, convinced it held the secrets of the soul. But she allowed no one inside her most sacred room. The chamber itself became myth. Some said it smelled of rot, others of roses. But all agreed on one detail: shelves upon shelves from floor to ceiling, lined with glass bottles. Each sealed, each labeled with nothing but a symbol only she understood. Thousands of whispers, frozen in time, pressed together in that silent vault. What did she plan to do with them all? Was it power alone? Or did she intend something far darker? Something that needed every last sigh, every last fragment of life to complete. One chronicle ends with a warning: when she dies, beware her last breath, for it will not go free into heaven, but into a bottle of her own keeping. No guest was ever truly welcome in the deepest corridor of her estate. The manor itself was built like a labyrinth, a maze of crooked staircases and long stone halls that always seemed colder than they should. But at the very end, beneath a door carved with symbols older than the church, was the chamber no servant dared linger near. They called it the Room of Whispers. The chamber was not large, but it was suffocating in its silence. Stone walls wept with dampness, though torches never seemed to flicker. And everywhere, every surface, every corner, stood the bottles. Glass vessels of every size sealed with wax, their contents invisible, but never truly still. Those who came close claimed they could hear faint hisses, almost like sighs. Not the air escaping, but the breaths themselves straining against their prisons. A soldier's rattle, a child's whimper, a priest's final prayer. The noblewoman would walk among them in silence, her fingertips grazing each bottle as though they were living relics. She kept count of them all. Each shelf was organized with ruthless precision, but it was not mere collection. It was communion. Once every new moon, she performed the rite. Servants described the preparation only in fragments, for none dared watch for long. She would light candles of tallow mixed with herbs, draw symbols in chalk across the floor, and kneel in the center of the chamber. Then, with slow, deliberate hands, she would select a bottle. She never chose at random. She always knew exactly which one she needed. The seal would crack with a sound far too loud for wax. And then, silence. She would press the glass to her lips, inhaling the stale air with hunger. Witnesses swore her body shuddered violently, like a drowning woman dragged back to shore. Her voice would change, sometimes deep and guttural, sometimes weak and trembling. For moments, she became the one who had died. Their final words passed her lips as though they had never ended. In these trances, she predicted storms, betrayals, and wars with uncanny precision. Chronicles note that 3 dukes sought her guidance before battles, and each time, her counsel brought victory. One commander even refused to march until she had drunk the last breath of a warrior, convinced it was the only omen worth trusting. But darker stories whisper of curses. She once unsealed the breath of a man who had died of plague, and within days half a village collapsed in fever. In another tale, she unleashed the sigh of a hanged thief inside a rival's castle. By morning, 3 of the rival's heirs had strangled themselves in their beds. The power of her bottles was clear, but the cost was not yet known. Some say she began to change. At first, her skin grew pale, her eyes darker, but soon her voice fractured. At times, she spoke in whispers that did not belong to her. At feasts, she laughed in the tones of men long buried. Alone in corridors, she argued with voices that no one else could hear. The chamber had become not merely her treasury, but her torment. And then came the greatest rumor of all, that she sought to weave the breaths together, not to use them separately as weapons or visions, but to combine them into a single force. A storm of souls, bound and contained, strong enough to tear open the veil between life and death. Her obsession grew. Bottles filled faster. She paid mercenaries to bring her the dying from distant lands. Prisoners vanished from dungeons, delivered to her doorstep. One monk accused her of murdering the weak outright, stealing their last exhale before mercy could be granted. Whether true or not, the fear was enough to turn villages against her. But no revolt ever succeeded. Those who tried found themselves gasping in the night, breath stolen as if unseen fingers pressed their lungs shut. Always the whisper followed, "Exhale, and you are mine." The collection swelled to hundreds, then thousands. The chamber became unbearable even to her most loyal servants, who claimed the walls seemed to hum, alive with voices clawing for release. What was she building? A library of death? A weapon? Or something worse? Something that needed every last sigh of every last man? No one ever knew the full truth, but one chronicle closes with a chilling sentence. Her bottles outnumbered her prayers, and when she entered the chamber, she no longer walked alone. The legends agree on this. Her power was not in the collection itself, but in the moment she tried to weave them together. For years, she had inhaled single breaths, testing their potency. A warrior's dying gasp gave her ferocity. A priest's sigh gave her words of prophecy. The rattle of a plague victim gave her curses. But the noblewoman began to wonder, what if she inhaled many? What if the last breaths of dozens or even hundreds were combined into a single inhalation? Whispers from her surviving servants describe a night unlike any other. The chamber of whispers was not silent. It pulsed. The bottles trembled faintly, as if unseen hands beat against the glass. Some claimed to hear fragments of words, the faintest syllables of dying tongues. The noblewoman dismissed her household, locking herself in the chamber. Only one maid, trembling in the hallway, claimed she saw what followed through the crack of the door. First came preparation. Candles of human tallow lined the shelves, flickering with unnatural steadiness. Symbols of circles within circles were chalked into the stone floor. At the center stood a great vessel, larger than a man's chest, empty, its mouth wide like a screaming face. Into this jar, she intended to summon not one whisper, but all of them. She began with the oldest bottles. She broke their seals one by one, tilting them into the jar. The maid swore she heard sighs escape. Some soft, others violent, as though choking. One bottle shattered, and the breath inside did not vanish. It clung to the air, twisting like smoke before plunging into the waiting vessel. Her chanting grew louder. Latin phrases mixed with sounds that were no language at all. The breaths poured faster. Dozens of bottles cracked. The room filled with invisible weight, the sensation of lungs collapsing, though no hands touched them. The maid gasped for air, even in the corridor, as though the act of breathing itself was being stolen. When she reached 100 bottles, the torches dimmed. When she reached 300, the chamber shook. And when she reached 500, the maid fled in terror, her ears ringing with voices that were not her own. But what did the noblewoman experience inside? Some chronicles attempt to describe it. One states that the vessel filled with the voices of the dying, a chorus of thousands crying out in agony, and yet when she inhaled, there was silence, as though she swallowed all of them in a single breath. Another account says her body lifted from the ground, every candle flame stretching upward as though pulled into her lungs. What followed was no miracle, but a curse. The next day, the manor gates were opened, and villagers entered with trembling hands, expecting to find corpses. Instead, they found her standing in the great hall. Her eyes were black as stone, her mouth twisted in a half-smile. She spoke, but her voice was wrong. It was not one voice, it was hundreds. Each word echoed as if a chorus spoke through her. She declared things no mortal could know. She recited the hidden sins of every man in the room. She told one farmer of the theft he had committed at age 12. She told another of the exact hour his wife would die. When the villagers fled, she laughed, but the sound was fractured, as though each laugh belonged to a different throat. From that day forward, her body was never fully her own. Servants claimed she spoke to herself in the voices of strangers. At times, her gait shifted. She walked like a soldier one moment, a child the next. She began to eat sparingly, as though the breaths themselves were her sustenance, and the bottles did not stop multiplying. She demanded more, always more. Mercenaries dragged prisoners to her dungeon. Some were executed only so she could capture their last exhale. Others were starved until their dying sigh could be harvested. The manor became less a home, more a slaughterhouse for whispers. But the ritual came with a terrible cost. The land around her estate began to rot. Crops withered in the soil. Cattle were born twisted, lungs too weak to live. Children gasped for air in the night, dying as though an invisible hand pressed upon their chests. Priests blamed her directly, declaring that she had broken the natural covenant between breath and soul, that by binding death into bottles, she had poisoned life itself. She did not deny it. She embraced it. Some chronicles insist she prepared a second ritual, far greater than the first, not a merging of hundreds, but of every bottle she had ever collected, a final exhalation that would tear open the veil of death, not for a vision, not for a curse, but for passage. Passage into what? That was the question. Some claimed she sought immortality, others, reunion with a lost lover. Still others believed she wanted dominion over the souls themselves, to become not merely a noblewoman, but death incarnate. The attempt, if it ever occurred, is shrouded in mystery. All that is known is this. One night a glow was seen from the manor, so bright it lit the sky as though fire had consumed the building. But when villagers arrived the next morning, there was no fire, no smoke, no ruin. The manor stood intact, yet the noblewoman was never seen again. Inside the chamber, shelves were shattered, wax seals broken, bottles in fragments. And in the silence, villagers swore they heard it, an echo, a whisper that was not their own. Thousands of voices still lingering, restless, unbound. The noblewoman had vanished, but the breaths remained. The noblewoman was gone, but her absence did not bring peace. The villagers who entered the Chamber of Whispers after that final night found not an empty room, but a graveyard of glass. Thousands of bottles shattered, shards glinting in the candlelight. Yet the air was heavy, as if filled with unseen lungs. No sound, no scream. But every man who entered swore he could feel breaths brushing his neck, rising and falling as though the chamber itself inhaled. They sealed the room, bricked it up stone by stone, muttering prayers with every hammer strike. But prayers were not enough. The manor remained poisoned. In the kitchens, servants collapsed without warning, their faces blue as if strangled by invisible hands. In the fields, oxen refused to breathe deeply, their bodies wasting away. Even the birds avoided the roof, circling but never daring to land. Rumors spread that the noblewoman had not died at all. Some claimed she had inhaled so many final breaths that she ceased to belong to one body, that she had dissolved into the very air, present in every exhale of her lands. Farmers told of hearing her whisper when they bent over their plows. Children gasped awake at night, certain someone had leaned close to their faces. Travelers spoke of waking in the inn to find their lungs empty, their dreams filled with voices too many to count. The church moved quickly. Priests declared the manor cursed, its mistress an agent of damnation. They burned her portraits, erased her name from records, and scattered salt across her grounds. But even fire and salt could not erase her. For decades, no one dared live in her halls. The building decayed, stone cracking, ivy wrapping its arms around broken windows. Yet the Chamber of Whispers remained sealed. Generations passed, and still the locals refused to tear it down. They feared what might be released if the stones were disturbed. But not everyone feared. Some were drawn to it. Alchemists and charlatans arrived, promising to bind the leftover breaths into potions of longevity. One physician claimed he had stolen fragments of her collection and inhaled them himself. Within weeks, he was found raving in the streets, speaking in the tones of 20 different men, each sentence cut short as though a throat had been crushed. A wandering knight once entered the chamber, tearing away the bricks with his sword. He lasted 3 nights before his horse returned alone, dragging his armor behind it. His body was never found. Even centuries later, the legend endured. A manuscript from the 1600s warns travelers not to camp near the ruins, for the air itself remembers, and the noblewoman still hungers. Another tale insists that a group of thieves broke into the manor searching for treasure, only for 3 of them to collapse mid-step, their lips trembling with words they had never spoken. And then there were the collectors. Whispered societies in Europe sought remnants of her work, claiming bottles still existed outside the manor, hidden in monasteries, buried in graves, carried by families who once served her. Each bottle, if found, was priceless, not for money, but for power. To own the last breath of a man was to own a piece of his death. Some say the bottles still surface, traded in secret auctions. A general before battle, a politician before election, a merchant before sealing a deal. The ritual of inhaling another's final whisper, they say, did not die with her. It spread, scattered, waiting for those bold or foolish enough to repeat her sin. Her body was never found, her grave never marked. And perhaps that is the most terrifying truth of all. For if she became air, then she is still with us. Every sigh, every gasp, every final whisper of the dying may still feed her. Invisible, patient, eternal. Time passed, but the whispers did not die. Long after the manor had crumbled into ruin, stories of the noblewoman's collection bled into the folklore of Europe. In some villages, parents warned children not to sigh too heavily at night, lest their breath be stolen. In others, the dying were urged to breathe their last into the open sky, far from windows or bottles, to deny any chance of capture. Priests adapted rites to include prayers not just for the soul, but for the purity of the departing breath. The noblewoman's obsession had infected the culture. Manuscripts from occult circles began to appear in the 1500s, describing her practices not as madness, but as revelation. These texts insisted that a person's final breath was the purest form of their being, the very thread that tied flesh to spirit. Whoever controlled it could wield the essence of the soul itself. And so, the imitation began. Secret orders sought to bottle breaths of criminals before executions. Some whispered that kings demanded the last gasp of enemies, sealed in crystal flasks as trophies. Even whispers of plague victims were harvested, carried across borders by unscrupulous physicians promising immunity. Each attempt seemed to repeat the same horrors: madness, suffocation, or sudden death. Yet the allure remained too strong. What terrified the church most was not the imitation, but the inheritance. The noblewoman had no recorded children, no legitimate heirs. But rumors persisted of a hidden line, descendants scattered through Europe who carried her obsession in their blood. In every generation there were strange figures: nobles who kept sealed jars in their chambers, widows who demanded to be present at executions, physicians who traveled with empty flasks in their medical kits. The idea that her work had never truly ended gnawed at those who studied her legend. Some claimed to find proof. A Jesuit in the 1700s recorded an interrogation of a noblewoman in France who admitted to possessing the whispers of 6 men. She was never tried, for she was found dead in her cell before dawn, her body untouched, but her lips frozen open, as if exhaling something that was no longer there. In England, rumors spread of a collector who owned a bottle said to contain the sigh of an executed queen. No one who inhaled it lived longer than 3 nights. And then there were the wars. Soldiers in the trenches of the 19th century told stories of commanders who carried glass vials into battle. Some believed these contained morphine, others poison. But the soldiers swore they heard faint breaths escape when the bottles broke. The inheritance of silence had crossed centuries. Today, the ruins of her manor are nearly erased, reclaimed by earth and forest. Yet travelers still speak of unease near the site. Phones die, voices echo strangely, and in the dead of night, if you stand still enough, you might swear that your own breathing does not belong to you, that something else inhales as you exhale, patient, waiting. Whether the noblewoman herself lives on is unknown, but her legacy, the hunger for the last breath, remains. It spreads quietly, an obsession that resurfaces in every era, cloaked in secrecy, traded in shadows. Because after all, what is more intimate than breath? What is more terrifying than losing it? And what kind of power might someone hold if they could bottle yours before it slipped away? They said she vanished. They said the manor fell silent, but silence can be deceiving because every story of the noblewoman does not end with her. It ends with us. Consider this. Her obsession was not wealth, nor war, nor glory. It was the breath itself, the one thing every living being must give away at the end. She understood what few dared to imagine, that the final exhale is more than air. It is surrender. It is everything you were, leaving in a single fragile moment. To catch it, to hold it, is to own the essence of death itself. And once that truth was whispered into the world, it could never be erased. You heard how imitators tried to repeat her rituals, how nobles, priests, and physicians reached for bottled whispers as though they were coins to be spent. You saw how her influence lingered through centuries, how rumors of bottles still surface in hidden circles. What began in one woman's chambers has stretched into a shadow that crosses ages. Now ask yourself, what would happen if even one bottle survived intact? Somewhere in a monastery vault, in a forgotten attic, or in the hands of a collector obsessed with power, one of her sealed flasks could still exist. Inside it, a whisper frozen in time, the gasp of a dying soldier, the sigh of a condemned man, the prayer of a plague victim, all waiting for someone foolish enough to break the seal. And if the noblewoman's final act was to merge voices into herself, then what if her own last breath was bottled too? What if she inhaled it, trapping her own death in glass, making herself eternal in ways we cannot comprehend? When you exhale at night, when your chest rises and falls in sleep, how can you be sure you are the only one breathing? What if every sigh you release is not lost but taken? What if her hunger never ended, only spread, reaching through centuries, mouths unseen, pressed against the air around you? Maybe that is why we shiver in the dark, not from cold, but from the sense that our breath does not belong to us, that something waits for it, patient and tireless. The noblewoman's story is not a closed tale. It is a question hanging in the air, pressing against your lungs right now. When your final moment comes, when your last whisper leaves you, will it rise free into the heavens, or will it be caught, sealed, and kept by hands you will never see?